Hello, welcome to the ultimate setup guide for the AYN Odin 3. The steps in this guide will also be applicable to the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 portal. I haven't tested them on any other company's devices, but as it's an Android-based device, the steps will be 99% the same, save for some minor changes. Just before we get started, I want to say up front, this will be a long video. We're going to cover downloading our emulators, setting up our folders, getting those emulators running, making sure we've got the best performance out of those emulators. It will be a very in-depth and a long video. And if you're brand new to emulation, this might be overwhelming. So take your time. Don't worry. If you get frustrated, put it down for a moment, come back to it later. All I'd say to people out there who are brand new to emulation, your first goal is to get one game running. That's all you need to focus on. Get one game, set up that emulator, get that game running, and then we'll go from there. We'll also look at some front ends at the end, and I'll show that most of them are designed for the single screen. However, some of them are based on the dual screen version, so things like ESU, Cocoon, that have a single screen mode. So I'll quickly demo those as well at the end, and then from there you can kind of pick your favorite. So enough of me waffling, let's dive in. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I have completely factory reset my own device. The only thing that I've done on top of that is I've enabled some developer options so I can enable the capture, so I can have the screen on screen. So everything you see will be as it starts when you first complete the initial process where you set up your Wi-Fi network and things like that. So I'm going to enable those developer options, and then we'll flip over and I'll show you my screen on the Odin 3. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, and this is something that you can do whilst you're waiting for your device to arrive, is we can start getting some games and some folders together. So luckily, Russ from Retro Game Core has created a folder template which we can use. This specific folder template is based on the ESDE front end, which is something I'll cover briefly at the end if you're not familiar with it. Basically, that particular front end uses a very specific folder layout, and it's kind of becoming the de facto standard because in terms of organization, it just helps with that consistency. So we're going to go to our browser, and then we're going to get the link. So so it's github.com/retrogamecore. I'll make sure all these links are in the description. So we want this one here, the ESDE directories. So as you can see, we've got this ROMs folder here. So we're going to go to releases on the side and get the first release, and then this roms.zip folder. So all this is just a folder full of folders. That's all it is. So we're going to extract that. There we go. So in here, there's also another ROMs folder. So you can see we have 180 different folders. So the folders in here will be for our systems. So there'll be tons in here that you've never even heard of. I've never even heard of most of them, but the essential ones that most of you guys will be after are in here. Look, we've got Dreamcast there. We've got Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color. Some of them are a little less obvious. For example, GameCube is referred to as GC. I know that a lot of other emulators either call it GameCube, which makes the most sense to me, or NGC for Nintendo GameCube. So this is the best layout to use for the Odin, just because a lot of other front ends are starting to utilize this layout, and it just makes things a little bit easier. We've got Nintendo 3DS, we've got the DS, NES, all our systems, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, Vita, PSP, all that good stuff in there. So when you get your game files, you've got to drag them into here. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to make a little folder on my desktop, and I'm going to call this Odin 3. And I'm going to take that ROMs folder and I'm going to pop it into there just to keep everything out of my downloads folder so it doesn't get too cluttered. Also in here, I'm going to create a folder called BIOS, B-I-O-S. What that is some emulators will need specific files for them to run. Not all of them, But a lot of the later systems, so for example, your PlayStation 1, your PlayStation 2, your Switch will need some firmware. Anything from the kind of mid-90s onwards will most likely need a form of BIOS. So if you're not 100% sure what a BIOS is, if you ever had a PlayStation, for example, and you turned it on and it came up with a big logo, or if you had the PS2, the blue tower-looking things, that is your BIOS. And what that is the system's software. So that's where it does a lot of the copyright checks and things like that. So unfortunately, the BIOS files are copyrighted, so I can't show you exactly where to get them, but I can tell you which ones I use. They are very, very easy to find if you just search for the name of the file. Also, the same goes for the ROMs. I have ROMs downloaded already. Unfortunately, you'll have to locate your own game files. So now we have that folder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new tab. I'm just going to copy over some games. So whilst you're waiting for your device to arrive and you're spending hours refreshing the tracker or the shipping dashboard or poking your head out the window trying to catch a glimpse of the mailman, this is something you can be doing instead to try and pass the time a little bit quicker. So one thing to note as well is my ROMs, my games, are compressed. So I did do a video on this, so I'll link that below in the description as well. So if you want to save space, for example, if you've got a base model of the Odin 3, I have the Ultra. I was lucky enough to snap one of these up, so I have a terabyte internal storage, so I'm not using an SD card. You can copy these to an SD card if you'd like. However, for this tutorial, I will solely be focusing on the internal storage, which is usually more reliable and faster than using an SD card anyway. So all my ROMs are already compressed. Be sure to check out that video if you have these massive files and you want to save some space. For some of the older systems, you'll notice that these are zip files. For some emulators, you can just leave the games in the zip files. Usually we call them cartridge-based ones. It's like your old classics. However, your disc-based ones, as we call them, usually they have to be extracted. Okay, so I've just transferred over some games to my folders ready to be placed on the Odin once we get to that stage. However, before we dive in, and I know there's a bit of prerequisite stuff, I wanted to cover some accounts that we'll need. This will make things greatly easier and also look loads better when we get to those stages. So first up, we have Screen Scraper. This is screenscraper.fr. If you're not familiar with what a scraper is, it's basically a way for your emulators and your apps to download the artwork off a massive database. You can get the artwork, there's gameplay videos, there's screenshots, fan arts, logos, copies of the actual physical media, whether it's the cartridge or the disc, all sorts of great stuff. So this is completely free. However, with the free version, you can only scrape so much per day. It is quite a generous limit. I can't remember the exact limit off the top of my head. However, if you find yourself hitting those limits, then the premium cost I paid, I think it was like €10 for the highest tier, which gives you tons more access. It lets you scrape simultaneously. And for the sake of supporting these guys as well, it's pocket change, really. So that is something that you must have. It's technically optional. However, I do stress it will make your life infinitely easier. So all you're going to need for this is an account to log into. Next, we're going to have Steam Grid DB. This is kind of similar. However, it can have better quality artworks and things like that. And also a lot of the front ends do tend to use this kind of as the default. So there's all sorts of cool. We can see here, we've got someone has photoshopped Charlie Kirk into Crusader Kings. So there are some interesting artworks out there. So make of that what you will. So we have things like these grids. We've got our heroes. That's our big kind of artworks at the top. Massive SpongeBob here. Then we have our game logos, our icons. So this is the kind of artwork that's available. So all you need for this is your Steam account. I imagine most of you will, by this point, at some point in your life, have set up a Steam account. So all you need to do is log in through your Steam account, and then we're going to go to Profile and Preferences. However, what I'm going to do is just blur my screen. In this Preferences screen, there will be an API key. So I'll just momentarily unblur it. So you'll see at the top, we have these tabs. We're looking for this API tab. So this is basically a unique key which acts as a kind of password for our emulators and our apps to communicate with the servers. So thoroughly recommend doing this. I'm going to blur, obviously, my key because it's personal to me, but nice and easy to find. You can save this to a notepad or copy it down somewhere just so you don't have to keep logging in. Okay, I'll close that for now. Next up, we have retro achievements. Now, if you've been following my channel, you'll know that I'm a big proponent of retro achievements. I absolutely love them. I think it's probably my favorite feature of all these emulators. So if you're not familiar with what retro achievements are, I'm sure you'll be familiar with Xbox achievements or Steam achievements or PlayStation trophies. So what retro achievements is, literally what it says on the tin, it adds a achievements layer to your retro games. So if you hover over this games drop down here, we can see there's all sorts of systems. There's also Nintendo Wii, which at time of recording is about 4 days away from launch. So eagerly anticipating that. So we can see we've got tons of consoles on here. There's literally thousands of games, not all of them. I did a whole video covering in depth how retro achievements works, so be sure to check that out as well. So what you need is an account, again, completely free. In that account, if we go to our settings, and then I will blur this as well, but if we scroll down, you'll see there's a section called authentication, and in there's a web API key. So exact same principle as Steam Grid DB. Sometimes the emulators just need your login for retro achievements. Sometimes it will ask for your API key. So do make note of it, as you might need to refer to it later. And finally, and most importantly, we have the RetroPup YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe. I do tons of tutorials, you can see here at a quick glance. I've got loads of tutorials all about Android-based handhelds and emulation in general. So if you've got any questions about any of this setup guide, I've probably got into it in greater detail in one of these videos that are already up or something that will be coming later. I also have a Discord, which will be linked below. So if you have any questions, there's myself, there's guys in my community who are always eager to help out. And I'm aware that this is a lot of people's first exposure to emulation, and it can be very overwhelming and it can be a bit stressful, but there are enough people out there who will assist. So never be afraid to ask questions or ask for help, but do make sure you give RetroPup a subscribe. So it's finally time. Your Odin's arrived, you've assaulted the postman trying to rip it off his hands, and you are ready. So I'm using a Windows PC for this. You can use Mac, Linux, anything, although I do believe that for the transferring over USB, I don't know how well this will work on Mac or Linux because of the way. I think Linux might be fine. Mac OS might be a bit finicky depending on the file structure. I have covered in detail how to transfer games wirelessly if you are on a Mac, so do be sure to check out that video as well. All the links for anything I reference will be in the description. So when you plug in a USB cable to your Odin, you'll get a little pop-up on the device itself that will say, do you want to enable file transfer? If you just tap yes, then your device will pop up here. You can see mine here, the Odin 3. And now I can access the internal storage. If you have an SD card, you'll see the SD card listed here as well. But like I said at the beginning, I'm only using the internal storage. So we're going to go into this, and you can see here is the Odin file structure. Nice and simple. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to get both of those folders, and I'm just going to drag them in. And I'll come back once this is done. So finally, enough messing about, let's actually get to the device itself. I appreciate your patience. So this is what your Odin 3 will look like. You can see that I haven't touched anything outside of, I've set the theme to the dark theme because I think it looks better. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've just enabled some developer options so I can actually capture the Thor screen on my PC. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of these icons. So I'm going to press and hold and then drag them to the top and then just drop them in the remove ones. So this won't actually remove them from the device because they are built in. However, it will keep your screen nice and tidy. So I'm going to remove the stock files app, and then on the Google Play Store, which I'm going to drag up there, I'm going to download Solid Explorer. So this is my file browser of choice. I really like it. All my videos, I tend to use Solid File Explorer. It's just a file explorer, but I think it's better because it has a nice split screen. So I'm just going to enable all that, and then we'll go for the nice material theme, and then we'll grant the permissions for that. You can use the stock version if you like. However, I think this is much easier, mainly because we have this nice split screen view, so we can copy and paste between apps a lot easier. So the first thing we're going to want to get is an app called Obtainium. So what Obtainium is it is a way to basically manage all our emulators and automatically download any updates or add any new apps and things like that. So if we go to Chrome and then we just search for Obtainium, we're going to get this link though by Imran R98. So that's the one we want. So if we click into that link, if you're new to GitHub, it can look a bit overwhelming at first, but all we're looking for is on the right hand side, you'll see there's this little releases section just above my head here. So currently at time of recording, it's version 1.3.4. We're going to tap into that, scroll down, and there's tons and tons and tons of versions here. The only one we're interested in is this app release.apk, just that one there. So I'm just going to tap that and then let it download. Shouldn't take too long. And I'm going to open that. So the first time you download an app from Chrome, you'll have to basically let it install the app. So we'll hit settings and then we'll just allow. We'll be doing that a lot for the first time setup. So once I've done that, do you want to install this app? Yes, we do. So by default, Obtainium will be empty because you can use Obtainium for any app on GitHub. All it does is check for updates. So we've not given it any apps that we want to actually track. So next up, we're going to need an emulation pack. So the one we're going to use, the best one, is the RJNY emulation pack, which, full disclosure, I have contributed to in the past, only because it is the best emulation pack out there. So I fully recommend it. So we're going to scroll down. We're going to go to our releases. So it was last updated a couple of days ago. And you can see here when our apps have been updated or removed. Now there are two versions. If you're on the AY and Thor or another dual screen Android device, you'll want the dual screen one. As I'm currently on the Odin, I'm going to use the standard one. The only difference is that some apps won't be present because they're more tailored to a dual screen experience. In terms of the emulators, all the emulators are still there. Most of the front ends are still there. It's just those specific apps that take advantage of the dual screen. So once that's downloaded, we're going to head back to Obtainium. There we go, swipe up. And then we're going to go to this Import Export tab. We're going to pick Obtainium Import, and then it should be at the top, that Obtainium Emulation Pack JSON file. We're going to open that, and then you can see there it's imported 42 apps and settings. So what I'm also going to do here, which I did forget to mention, is because there are so many apps, you might find yourself hitting some rate limits. So if you try and download too much too soon, it will go, whoa, hang on. You're hitting those servers a bit hard. The way to mitigate this is if you go to settings and then go down to this GitHub personal access token. What we need to do is you need to make yourself a GitHub account. Should have mentioned this earlier. So I already have one, so I'm going to sign in. And then I'm going to show you where to get the token from. Okay, once you've signed in, I'm going to tap on your little profile icon. We're going to go to settings and then scroll all the way down. On the left-hand side, you'll see developer settings, personal access tokens, and we're going to use a fine-grained token. So I've got one there from last week, so I'll just delete that. I'm going to generate a new token. So for the name, I'm just going to call it OB for Obtainium. Doesn't need a description. I'm not going to set an expiration date. We're going to allow public repositories, and then we don't need to add any permissions. So I'm just going to generate that token. Oh, I hit custom. I meant to hit no expiration. We'll hit generate token, and then this will give me a token. So when that token pops up, we're going to copy it and we're going to paste it over to that fine-grained personal access token. So there we are. I've pasted mine in, and then all I need to do is if I go to, I think you should save it automatically actually. So you can adjust the background interval checking. I tend to just leave it at 24 hours or a day, just so it does a daily check. It doesn't need to do it that often. And you can enable background updates as well, so it'll automatically, if it can, enable those updates. So now we'll go to our apps. So we'll go through, and I'm not going to download all of these because there are tons and tons and tons out there. All I'm going to do is download the ones that we're going to cover today. So a PS3 is a PS3 emulator. PS3 emulation is in its extreme infancy. I've tried it, managed to get some stuff running, but not to a level that I think is currently playable. So if you want to mess around with PS3 emulation, by all means. However, I won't be covering it in this video. I have covered it in other videos, and I know that people in my Discord and who have followed my channel have also been playing around with it. It does get updated semi-regularly. However, like I said, it's very, very early. And the same goes for Xbox emulation, which is brand new, so I won't be covering that in this video either. ARM SX2 is a PS2 emulator. Again, still in very early development, so not one I'm going to cover today. Azahar is our 3DS emulator. I'm going to get that. So all you need to do is tap into it, tap install. Like I said, the first time you'll get asked to allow the apps. Then we'll go back and you'll get this little pop-up. So we're going to install Azahar. And then Cemu will be our Wii U emulator, so we're going to make sure we get that as well. Citra MMJ is another 3DS emulator. Some people download both. For me, I found that Azahar did everything I needed it to. However, some people report that some games run better. For this video, I'll only be setting up Azahar. I do have specific system setup guides where I go into in-depth about different emulators. But just to keep things as simple as possible, because this is already going to be a long enough video, we're just going to use Azahar. Dolphin emulator. This is a classic emulator. It's probably one of the longest running, one of the best. This does Wii and GameCube games. Duckstation is our PS1 emulator. Great PS1 emulator. Unfortunately, the Android version is no longer maintained, but the app itself still runs great, so it's still worth getting. Odin will be that cheeky Nintendo console, whose name I'll have to refrain from saying due to them being very lawyer happy. If you know, you know. Flycast is Dreamcast. I have covered this in other videos. I won't be covering it in this one because I don't have any Dreamcast games to hand. MelonDS is our DS emulator. Surprise, surprise. One thing to note, with Azahar will only run 3DS games, and MelonDS will only run DS and DSi games. They will not run other DS games. Nether SX2 patch, this is going to be our PS2 emulator. Again, this is a fork of an older emulator that was no longer in development. It's a great version. There's classic version and there's patch version. The patch version just has some little tweaks in there to make it run even better on our Odin. Pico 8 is the fake console that's I've not really looked much into. I believe you have to pay for access to the console. Again, I won't be covering that in this video. Play is another PS2 emulator. I think it's an older one. It's fine. I prefer Nether SX2, so I won't be covering that either. PPSSPP is our PSP emulator, which is always a tongue twister, so we're going to need to get that. RetroArch. RetroArch is going to be the, pardon the pun, core of our emulation. So this will emulate everything from your really classic systems like your Ataris all the way up to, I think it even does PSP and PlayStation 1. However, for those consoles, I prefer to use the standalone versions. However, you can technically just use RetroArch for most systems if you like. However, you won't get the full performance benefit for some of the more intensive consoles. But you are going to want to install it, so we'll make sure you get RetroArch. And then what was next? RPCSX, that's another PlayStation 3 emulator. Scum VM is a, if you've ever played those classic point-and-click adventure games on PC, Scum VM is just the Android version of the Scum VM. It's very niche. I won't be covering that in this tutorial. It's relative. If you've used the PC version of Scum VM, the Android version is the same. Vita 3K is our Vita emulator. It's a little bit more involved than the PSP emulator. I have a separate video for Vita, as if you're brand new to emulation, I don't advise diving in at the deep end with Vita. Get comfortable with the other systems first, and then check out my Vita video because the process is a little bit more involved. I'll link that below in the description as well. And then X1 Box, which is the Xbox emulator, like I mentioned before. I have probably played around with this for about 30 seconds. So there will be a full guide and review coming up for that, but I won't be covering it in this video. Now, front ends. You've probably seen a lot of talk about front ends and what they are and why they're important, that kind of thing. If you're not familiar, a front end is basically a lovely way to display your entire game's library, where you can customize it, you can add themes and things like that. It just makes the whole experience a little bit more streamlined rather than going, oh, I want to play this game, but did I have it in this emulator or this emulator and having to go through manually? You can have one unified front end and it's all got the nice artwork. So that's why we got screen scraper and things like that. And I'll also show you how to disable that annoying panel refresh shortly. But basically, these are, in my opinion, a must-have. I'll briefly cover some at the end. However, the most popular one, I think, at the moment is Cocoon. And then ISU is another popular one. Pegasus is also on here. Now, I will not cover Pegasus. I have tried and tried and tried and tried. And for the love of God, I cannot get Pegasus to work in a way which is translatable to those less tech savvy. It is very involved and other front ends, in my opinion, have lapped it. My personal favorite front end of choice is ESDE, Emulation Station Desktop Edition. That is what those initial folder structure is based on. It's what a lot of these base their folder structures on, and it is paid. So what you have to do is you have to sign up to their Patreon. They will add you to a mailing list and send you a link to that APK. So I will cover that as well. But for the purposes of this one, I'll cover Cocoon because it's the most popular one. The developer, Moth, is another fellow Northerner, so shout out to Moth. He's a great guy. He's done some excellent work, and he will only continue to do excellent work. So we'll install that as well. We also have our PC emulation. So this can vary on the games. So the ones I've covered in the past have been GameHub Lite and GameNative. I think personally that if you want the most seamless setup, then either of those is fine. GameHub Lite's development has taken a slight step back. I know the developer Productivity has basically, the reason it's GameHub Lite, so the company Gamester who make controllers, they created GameHub, which is a PC emulation for Android. However, they had a lot of tracking and a lot of telemetry stuff in there, so people were a little bit uncomfortable giving their data to the Chinese, as to be expected. So Productivity, in his infinite wisdom, created a light version, which is essentially the same with all that stripped out. However, it's very intensive, and as he's not had access to the source code, he's essentially had to build it from scratch himself. He's a very busy man, so he's got enough on his plate. However, GameNative is a separate app, which is a lot of people's favorites. Personally, I'd recommend downloading both and then seeing which game handles it better. But for this, I'll just download GameNative because it's probably got a slightly easier setup, marginally anyway. So it's always good to kind of let these download and install one at a time. I could technically go back and carry on. However, I've found that when you kind of queue up the downloads and installs, it does panic a bit. There is also WinLater, which I have covered, although that's a quite an advanced one, so I wouldn't worry about that for now. There's also PC streaming, so you can set up things on your PC and you can basically control your computer remotely. I've got separate guides on this. Again, as this is just your initial setup guide, I won't cover this in this video. And then these ones we have track only. So these won't download and install, but it will basically let you know if there's an update available. So for example, the Obtainium emulation pack, we're going to mark that as installed. So anytime there's an update, you'll get a little ping that says, we're not going to download it for you, but just to let you know, there's an updated version available. So it might be some new apps or something like that. The Mr. Purple Turnip drivers we're going to need for our Switch emulation. For our secret emulation, I'll see you in prison. And I won't get the ESD custom systems yet, but I'll explain what they are later. And then we also have our Kimchi turnip drivers. However, I've found that the Mr. Purple turnips are better, if not as good. We also have some utilities. So we have Bifrost. Bifrost is a way to control the LEDs on the joysticks. I've covered this in a separate video. It's a cool little app. It's not one I use often, but there's separate videos for that. We also have CH Droid. This is a way to convert your PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PSP games into CHD files from ISOs or bin/Q files. It's basically a way to save a ton of space. That's all covered in my Shrink Your ROMs video. It does work on device. It's much faster and easier to do it on PC, so I wouldn't recommend doing it on the device itself. But if you're really stuck without a PC and you want to, you can do it. We also have Emu Ready Lite, which is by Product Devotee as well. So this is basically a community. It's a website that allows you to, if you're someone who emulates PC or that secret Nintendo console, then you can basically, not every game will work. And that is something I want to stress, is with the nature of emulation, you can do everything right, and sometimes the games just will not work, which is unfortunately the nature of the beast. So this is a website for people to report, oh, I've managed to get this game working, here's the settings I used, and here's what I did. So I'm going to make sure we install that because it's a very good utility to have. I have covered this in a separate video. I won't cover it in this one, but I'm going to install it anyway because it's very, very handy. ESD Android apps. This is redundant at this point. Basically what it was a way to, for the ESD front end, import your native Android games and apps. However, ESD has since been updated, so it has that feature natively. We're going to get Odin tools as well, because this has some funky stuff that we can play with. Pixel Guide, this works brilliantly. It probably works better on the Thor, because it's basically a way to have a walkthrough on the second screen. But it's a great little app to have anyway, so I do recommend downloading it. Sync Thing, this is for synchronizing your folders across devices or to your PC. I have covered this separately. It does have a very involved setup process. I tend to use it for save data. However, it's not perfect because of the nature of Android, and they've started to go the Apple route and create a kind of walled garden. So unfortunately, for a lot of the emulators we use, we can't access the save data, which is very frustrating and kind of makes the whole thing a little bit redundant. So hopefully in future, we'll be able to have a slightly easier to use option. And then there's just the Obtainium app at the bottom. So that's it for downloading our apps. So whilst I'm here, I'm just going to show you how to get rid of that annoying panel refresh. So we'll go to settings, scroll down, and we're looking for the Odin settings. And then we are looking for our, where's it gone? So I'm going to enable the OLED Ultra Black mode just because it looks really, really nice. OLED screen protection. So now, there's a lot of panic about burning and image retention and things like that. So I want to clarify, what you might have seen online is image retention. So what that is if you have a static screen for a good while, hour or so, you might notice that when you move over to another screen, you can still kind of see a bit of the image. That is not burning. Burning happens over thousands and thousands of hours of usage. So you might experience it on monitors or TVs or something where it does have that static image. For something like the Thor, where we're playing a lot of games, you won't really experience it. So to mitigate that, they added this panel refresh. But this is obviously just a factory setting. You do not need it to run every 30 seconds. That is overkill, and in the long run, it will probably do more harm than good to the device. What I do recommend, however, is the pixel shifter. So I keep it on a 1 pixel radius, and then I set it to 300 seconds. So basically every 5 minutes, it's going to move every pixel back and forth. You will not notice it. And it's a way to refresh the pixels in a way that's almost invisible. So that's how to get rid of that annoying thing. Just so I can carry on the setup without fighting with it. Okay, so if I have a look, so we've got all our apps here. So now we're going to go through and set up each of these apps. Okay, so just to give things a little bit of structure, what I've done is I've just moved the shortcuts over to my home screen, and we're going to cover them from top to bottom. So to do that, if you're not sure, if you're new to Android, if you swipe up from the bottom, that'll give you access to all your apps. Press and hold, and then you can just drag and then drop it wherever you like. So first up will be RetroArch. So I advise, regardless of what system you really want to focus on emulating, set up RetroArch first, because a lot of this can be based around that. It is probably the most popular emulator that you will use. So you'll want to, okay, we're going to grant it access to the storage. So RetroArch is like a multi-system emulator. So it's built up, we can download all these cores to handle different systems. It can be very overwhelming and very confusing, but fear not, I've done this many a times, so just follow along and you'll be fine. First thing we're going to do, because it's ugly as sin, is we're going to change the menu layout so it's a little bit nicer. So on the right hand side, where we have our settings cog, I'm going to tap that, and I'm looking for drivers. And then in our menu option, I'm going to change this to XMB. Then I'm going to press the little home icon. Now, what normally trips people up with RetroArch, still don't really know which is the correct pronunciation. So what trips people up is every time you make a change to the settings within RetroArch, you need to make sure you commit those changes by saving your configuration file. So every time you make a change, come to the home screen, tap your configuration file, and then save the current configuration. I will repeat this every time I do it, because I guarantee I can say it 1,000 times, you'll still forget to do it. I know I will. So now that's done, that change won't apply until I restart it. So I'm going to swipe up from the bottom, I'm going to clear the apps, and then I'm going to reopen it, and we should see, there we are. If you're familiar with the PS3 or PSP, this will be immediately familiar to you. This is the cross-media bar, the XMB layout. It's the simplest and nicest looking one to use for RetroArch. And also, probably the greatest UI that was ever created. And it pains me that Sony don't bring it back. So here is RetroArch. We've got all these tabs at the top, and then we can scroll up and down on each tab. The first thing I'm going to do is for our input, I'm just going to change the menu controls, because currently the B button on the Odin is acting as my confirm button, which, because it has the Nintendo layout of controls, is a bit confusing. So we're going to go into menu controls, and I'm going to just disable swap the OK and cancel buttons. And I'm going to back out of that. And then, like I said a moment ago, I'm going to come down to my configuration file, and I'm going to save that current configuration. Say it with me now. Save that current configuration, because you're going to forget to do it, and I'm going to forget to do it. Okay, so my screen capture decided to just completely die as I got halfway through the RetroArch setup. So take two. So one thing I want to do as well, and I advise you do, because this is a landscape device, is if you swipe down from the top and you get access to these quick options, if you scroll across and then enable, sorry, not that one, the force landscape option. And that will just make things a little bit easier. So where was I? So I just changed the menu controls. So next we're going to need to actually download the cores. What the cores are is they are basically mini versions of emulators for each system, but it sits under the umbrella of RetroArch just for ease of access. So we're going to come down to our online updater. We're going to go to our core downloader, and we're going to go through, and I'm going to tell you which cores I use. There might be some out there that are more preferable. However, you can't go wrong with these ones. So for our arcade games, I use the Final Burn Neo core. For Atari, I just use Stella for the 2600, a Atari 800 for the others, and I like also getting the 5200 and the 7800. There's also the Virtual Jaguar and the Beetle Lynx for those systems as well. I don't tend to play a lot of Atari games, but it's good to have them and not need them, than need them and not have them, which you can also apply to life. Obviously, if you want to emulate systems like the ColecoVision, the Commodore, any of the really obscure ones. If you want to get in the weeds in DOSBox, then feel free to install those cores as you see fit. But I'll be covering the main ones for the main systems, because there are some real obscure ones in here. So for the 3DS and the DS, I'm not going to download a core because we have standalone emulators for that. So where I've downloaded a standalone emulator from Obtainium, I won't be downloading the core. You can if you want to. However, you do lose a lot of the granular control that we want for those systems. For Nintendo Game Boy in Color, I'm going to get Gambate. For the GBA, I'm going to get MGBA. Like I just said, for the GameCube and Wii, I won't be getting the Dolphin core because we've got Dolphin installed anyway. I'm going to get Meson for the NES or the Famicom. For the N64, there is a N64 standalone emulator. It's available on the Google Play Store and it is paid. I've not tested it myself. I don't play a lot of N64 games, but when I do, then this Mupen 64 Plus Next GLES3 works a treat. So you can just use that one. For the SNES, I use the SNES 9X core. We'll get the Virtual Boy one, just if we want to give ourselves a migraine. And then you can get the Flycast core here if you want to emulate the Dreamcast, or you can use the standalone version of Flycast, which I tend to do. For our Sega stuff, so I use this Genesis Plus GX Wide. It's a mouthful. So as you can see there, MSGG MD CD, that's your Master System, your Game Gear, your Mega Drive, and your Sega CD. And your Genesis, which is the Mega Drive. You can also get the Pico Drive version as well if you want to emulate the 32X. For Saturn, I just get the Beetle core. PlayStation, I don't bother with because we have Duckstation. However, like I said, the Duckstation development has basically ceased on Android, so until someone else comes along and picks those reins up or starts their own app, you can stick with Duckstation or you can try one of the cores. If you do want to try a core, I recommend the Beetle PSX HW or Swan Station. Both of those work pretty well. And for the PPSSPP core, we're not going to get the core, we've got the full app anyway. I think that should be all of them. Okie dokie. So next we are going to update some of our files. So we're going to update our core info files, our assets, our controller profiles. I did these a moment ago. The cheats one can take a while just because there's millions and millions of files in there. So just click update on all these just to make sure that we're on the same page. Once you've done that, we are first going to set up our input device. So we need to tell RetroArch the controls we're going to use. So we're going to go into input. We're going to RetroPad binds and our port 1 controls. So by default, your analog to digital type will be none. I prefer to set this to left analog. What this means is when I use the left analog stick, it will translate those controls as though I was using the keys. So if you're playing a NES game, for example, if you prefer to use the analog stick instead of the D-pad, you can just enable this and it will do the same thing. You can also enable it on the right analog stick. I don't know who does that, but to each their own. So as you can see here, some of these keys, it looks like they're already mapped. However, this seems to be a default profile, not for the Odin controller. So the best thing to do is if you come up here and you'll see the set all controls option. So I'm going to tap that. And then for each, it will probably time out. So what it's going to ask you to do is going to give you the controls and it's going to tell you to press the corresponding key. So I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to press it. And then for the D-pad up, I'm going to press and hold up for a second, and then down for a second, left for a second, right for a second, and so on. I'm just going to hold the necessary buttons. You do have to make sure you hold them for a second for it to register. So do be especially wary as well with the analog sticks. You don't want to make sure you're actually on the right axis, otherwise you'll have some crazy stuff happening in your games. So there we are. So you can see that we've got this hat 0 up, we've got these button 97, button 96. So this is actually the Odin's controls. We don't need to set up a light gun. So there we are. So whilst we're here, what are we going to do? We're going to save that config file. I like to do this as I go along, just so if anything happens, like my capture card dies or my recording stops, then I've got a checkpoint that I can save from. Next, I'm going to go to, so for frame throttle, what I do is for our fast forward rate, I set this to 4 times. So if you're playing Pokemon or an RPG, for example, sometimes they do like to go on a little bit. So when we enable our hotkey to fast forward, what this will do is it will limit it, so it will only fast forward up to 4 times. If you have it set at 0, it will go as fast as it can, which means that it goes nuts and it's impossible to control. For our drivers, I don't think we don't need to change anything there. Well, for our video, I prefer to set this to Vulkan, due to the fact that the Snapdragon Elite that's in the Odin, and if you're on the Thor or another Android device, the Vulkan drivers are usually a little bit more powerful. But for these systems, it doesn't make a massive difference. Playlists we don't need to worry about. Core, if you want to change or manage cores, then this is where you come to do it. If you want to delete an old core, for example, you can just come into the core itself and then you can delete it. For saving, if you prefer to manage your saves differently to the default, so by default, it will save them by core name. So for example, you'll have a folder that says MGBA or SNES 9X, whatever it might be. However, I prefer to do them by content directory. So what this will do is I'll have a folder that says GBA. I'll have a folder that says NES, SNES. So if I want to move them about, they're much easier to manage. It does have built-in gameplay recording. I didn't think it was that great, so I didn't bother. Configuration. So you can have this where it's save configuration on quit. However, I found it doesn't work that well. So for peace of mind, do it manually. My software has died again. So I'm going to save my configuration file and I'm going to just close it off. And then I'm going to reboot it. There we go. Very, very frustrating when that happens. Where was I? So accessibility, if you are someone that requires text-to-speech, then you can have that here. I've not tried any of the AI translation services, but it's good to know they exist. Power management, you can just leave those as default. Network, this is for the net play. I have covered some of this with regards to Pokemon. I will be doing some more multiplayer coverage in the coming weeks once I've kind of got my head around how not only does RetroArch handle it both on your local area network and if you want to play with friends over the internet, also how is it handled in the other emulators that offer that net play. So you can have a play around with that. For achievements, we've set up our Retro Achievements account. You should have done if you watched the start of the video. So this is where you log in. So we're going to enable the achievements and all we're going to do is pop in our username and password. So I am going to just skip this bit. So I'm going to cut this bit out and then I'll have logged in. Okay, there we are. So I've logged in and you can change your appearance. So I just leave it as, so the achievements come up in the top left of the screen. And you can also have an aligned padding just to kind of give it a nice little bit of padding, so depending on your screen size, it doesn't stick right to the top. For visibility, you can have it so if a game has an achievement, it will tell you we found it and here's how many achievements you have. I advise leaving this as default. Also, you can customize which notifications show. For example, for the active challenge indicators in the bottom right of the screen, it's hard when it's mirrored. Sometimes when you're playing games that have achievements, you might see little icons pop up. And all that means is at this point in the game, you can earn an achievement. You also have progress indicators. So, for example, I've been playing Pokemon Fire Red. So one of the achievements for that is for catching all the Pokemon that are available in the game. Every time I catch a Pokemon that's new, it will pop up with a little counter in the corner and say I've captured one of 170 or however many unique Pokemon there are in Fire Red. There's also leaderboards, which is part of Retro Achievements. So some of them, it will set timers. If you're doing things like Super Mario speedruns, you can submit those as well. There's also things like login messages that will say we've logged into your account. It's all good. And then verbose messages if there's any errors and things like that. So I tend to leave these as default. Hardcore mode. So what this is on Retro Achievements, you have hardcore and you have softcore. And hardcore is, as it says here, it will disable cheats, save states, the ability to rewind, anything to give you an unfair advantage. If you turn this off, you can use all those features, but you can only unlock softcore achievements. And is that really an achievement? It's entirely up to you. You do you, I don't care. I play hardcore because I'm an elite gamer. But for those of you that aren't, you can enable or disable this as you see fit. Rich presents. It will show on the Retro Achievements website if you're currently playing a game. I leave this on. Badges. This is more for the internal RetroArch side, so you don't really need to leave that. You can test unofficial achievements. So all the achievements are by a community of developers who do it in their free time. They have a very rigorous process for approving achievements, which is good because it stops any kind of low quality achievements slipping through. But what you can do if you are a developer, you want to test your own achievements, or if there's a particular game that you want to follow that hasn't yet got achievements or they're in development, you can enable this and help those guys out just to make sure that the achievements do work as intended. Because unfortunately, basically the way Retro Achievements works is it looks at a lot of the memory values. It's very complex. It's a work of absolute genius what these guys are doing, but it does need a little bit of help when it comes to the actual testing. Unlock sound, of course we want the unlock sound. Automatic screenshot, I tend to leave this off because I've never seen a screenshot across all the systems I've played where it has this feature where I thought, wow, I'm glad it took that screenshot. And then encore mode is you can unlock the achievements even if you've already unlocked them. So if you want to get them again. I don't believe it updates when you initially achieve them on the Retro Achievement side, but I've never really used it. So someone who has will probably be able to correct me on that. For our user settings, this is more for the specific net play stuff. Again, I'll be covering this in detail in a later video. Now for directory, this is where we want to point some of our directories. So for example, for our BIOS files, obviously, if you got the RetroArch BIOS pack, which I had at the start, then we have to tell RetroArch where it is. It's not a necessity for a lot of these systems on RetroArch. However, it can help with a lot of the running of the game. So it's always good to have it and not need it. So I'm going to select that. It will take you to the folder that it's currently in. In this case, we are inside the RetroArch app. So I want to hit parent directory. I'm going to go up, and now you can see I'm on the root storage of my Thor. So there we have my BIOS file. So I'm going to select BIOS, and in there I have my PlayStation 2, PlayStation 1, and Switch BIOSes. They are essential. You do need those for those systems. I'll cover that later. But for RetroArch, I've got one big RetroArch pack with everything in it. So I'm going to open that up, and then I'm going to select use this directory. And for save files, again, this will currently save them inside the RetroArch data itself. However, one of the advantages of RetroArch is you can save it outside of that. So if you have, I haven't set one up yet, but I have a saves folder in here so I can easily access my save data. but that's up to you. You can just leave it as is for now, and everything else we can leave as is. And for logging, this is more for things like errors, so don't worry too much about that. So the final part of the RetroArch setup is our hotkeys. So what these are is it's a way to access the RetroArch menu and things like that from within the games itself. So if we go back to input and then we go to hotkeys. So first we're going to need to set a hotkey enable button. So I usually use select. However, one of the advantages of the Odin is you have these extra buttons on the back. So you can set one of those if you like. However, because of muscle memory and force of habit, I'm just going to set it as select. So I'm going to press A and then I'm going to hold select. So there we go. It's assigned button 109. So what I can do in here is you can set a default menu toggle if you like. However, personally, I prefer to use this version and I set it to my X button. So now if I'm in a game and I hold select and press the X button, it will open the internal RetroArch menu, which I'll show you shortly. For quit, I have this as the start button. So if I hold select and press start, it will just quit out of RetroArch. And for fast forward, I like having the R2 button, the right trigger. And I also prefer to use the toggle version of that. You can just have the hold version if you want. I prefer to use the toggle. And then if you want to set any of these, you can, but they're the main ones I use. So that's entirely up to you. But you do need to make sure that you have set the hotkey enable. So that is basically it for the initial setup for RetroArch. You'll be glad to know. If you want to firstly save that config file, I nearly forgot. How embarrassing would that have been? So if you plan on using a front end like Cocoon, ESDE, ESU, whichever one you plan on using, then you don't need to actually load the games into RetroArch. What the front end will do is it will take the games you've given it and it will pass it over to RetroArch and it will say, use this core, here's the game, load it. However, if you want to do a test at this point and make sure that the games are booting and you've set things up right, then I'll show you how to do that now. So if we go to this little plus icon here and we press scan directory, I'm going to ask you to point to the directory. So we're looking for this one here, this storage /emulated/0. So if it's /0, that is your internal device storage. If you see one, if you have an SD card and you see one that says /storage/ and it's usually like an 8-digit ID number, then that'll be your SD card storage. So like I said at the start, I'm only using the internal storage for this, but if you wanted to point it at an external folder, you can do so. I'm going to find my ROMs folder. And as you can see, there's all my folders. I'm going to hit scan this directory. And as you can see at the bottom, it's going to fly through and it's going to scan any games it can and match them to its database. So if I back out, you can see here, I've got all these little system icons organized by systems. Now I know that the PS2, the PS1 and the PlayStation Portable ones aren't going to work because I don't have a core for them. However, if I want to boot, say, Castlevania, I'm going to go into it. You can also, as well, if you go to your online updater, you can turn on the on-demand thumbnail downloads if it doesn't already do it. That gives you the little artwork at the side. That's entirely up to you, though. So we'll open up Castlevania. So the first thing it's going to ask us to do, if I press run, it will ask us to assign a core. You can also do this by type. If we go back to playlists in our settings, we should see our manage playlists. My capture has died again for like the 10th time. So if you go to settings, then playlists, then manage playlists, here's all our systems. So I'm going to delete those PlayStation ones because I know that they won't work. Obviously, if you have the cores, they will work, although I don't know if there is a PS2 core yet. Something to maybe consider. If I go to NES, I can set the default core here. So if I say for NES, I want Meson. So now it won't ask me. So if I go back over to the NES and I go Castlevania and run, it knows I'm using Meson. We can see there that my retro achievements have popped up and I've not unlocked any yet. Now, unfortunately, we have this annoying overlay. So we need to disable that. So I'm going to hold my select button and press my X button, or whichever hotkey you set up. And then I'm going to go to my on-screen overlay. I'm going to just disable it. And then, what am I going to do? I'm going to save the config file. Don't forget to do it. So now if I do the same shortcut, if you hold, select, press X, or whichever your button is, if I press start, then you can see that the game has started. Have I got any audio on this? Oh yeah, I had it muted. So yeah, here we go. Castlevania. I'm terrible at Castlevania. I've never really played it. But so as I mentioned with those achievements before, you can see at the bottom, I've got that little counter that's counting up. So if I'm assuming if I get 6 of these little things, will I get an achievement? Was there only 5? Maybe not. And if I want to quit the game, I'm going to press hold select and press start, and then you'll get this little pop-up, press again to quit, and there we are. It'll completely kick you out of RetroArch. It'll go back to your front end of choice. In this case, I don't have one yet. It's just the default starting point. So that was setting up RetroArch. So next up, we have Duckstation. This is going to be our PS1 emulator. So let's load it up. Now, most of these emulators, they do have a very nice and very easy to follow onboarding. So what we're going to do is just go through the steps as it asks us. So we're going to hit next. So for our GPU renderer, I'm going to change this to hardware Vulkan. So this will allow us to do our internal resolution upscaling. So as you can see there, our internal resolution is currently 1, which will be the native resolution of the PS1. However, we can bump it up all the way to 5 times for our gorgeous 1080p screen. For our aspect ratio, you can set this to your personal preference. I tend to leave it as 4:3 because some games will have widescreen patches built in to Duckstation. Not all of them. So if you force it to 16:9, it can make things, it makes the characters look a bit chunky, which we don't want. Screen orientation I'll leave. So there we are, widescreen rendering. So that will patch if it's found a widescreen patch. And then the same for the PGXP geometry correction. So if you remember back to the days of the PS1, if you too are a millennial, then you might remember PS1 games, particularly games like Tomb Raider. If you were to turn the camera, you'd kind of notice that the polygons get a little bit wobbly as it readjusts the perspective. This just kind of reduces that. So I'm going to hit next. So this will be our BIOS. So I'm going to import our BIOS file, which I have in my BIOS folder. So like I said at the start, I can't tell you where to get these from, but I can tell you which one I used. So there's our PSX folder. So the one I'm using is the PSX on PSP 660.bin. This is actually the version that was used for the PSP, but it works perfect as a PS1 BIOS. So we'll load that up. It's imported. There we go. We'll hit next. So now we need to add our game directory. So I'm just going to go to my folder again. I'm going to find my ROMs folder, and I'm going to find my PSX folder. So there we go. So I've got some games in here. These are all single disc games. So for your Final Fantasies and your Metal Gear Solid, things like that, because it has multiple discs, they will show up as multiple entries. I have got a video covering multi-disc games for Emulation Station. I also have a script as part of that video which handles those. But for this setup guide, just focus on getting those single disc games running first, and then worry about the more complicated stuff once you're a bit more comfortable. So I'm just going to use this folder, and we're going to allow it. We'll hit next. So obviously for our retro achievements, so I'm just going to sign in here. So I'll be back shortly. And there we go. So I've been able to successfully log in. And that's the setup complete. So as you can see, automatically it has found my games. So first thing we need to do is set up our controller. So by default, it won't be mapped correctly. So we're going to go to our controller settings. I'm going to go to touchscreen, and I'm going to turn this off. So by default, you'll have the touchscreen overlay like we saw at the end of the RetroArch setup. So it's touchscreen controller view and just set that to none. And then port 1. Make sure the controller type is set to DualShock. You can perform an automatic mapping. However, what will happen, especially with the PS1 side, is it will map the A button as though it was the X button on the PlayStation, and the B button as though it was the circle button, and all the buttons will be incorrect. So what I tend to do is I perform an automatic mapping for the Odin controller, and then, as it says there, I'm going to double check. So for the D-pads and things like that, you can see that when I check and change them, nothing happens because they are correct. But so it says triangle is button 100. So I'm going to change it. And now it's 99. So you can see that those face buttons, a little bit off. But everything else should be good to go. Excellent. And then for our hotkeys, you can set your bindings. So unlike RetroArch, where you set a default hotkey enable and then a corresponding key, you set the bindings. So this is essentially a controller combination. So I use the same one as I did. So if I want to use, say, the fast forward toggle, I will hold my select button and press R2. And you can see there that it's got that controller mapping. And again, if you want to use quick loads, quick saves, that kind of thing, that is all there for you to have a play around with. So that's it for our controller settings. So now we're going to go into the app settings and just double check. Most of this should have been covered by the startup wizard. However, we can just double check to make sure that we've covered everything. So most of these you can leave as default. If you want to see things like the FPS, you can enable that. I tend to just leave it because I just trust it to do its thing. You can also have fast boot and fast forward boot. So this can make things a lot quicker, especially fast forwarded memory card access. So when you want to save games, it speeds up that. So I'm going to enable both of those. Things like optimal frame pacing and that, and skipping duplicate frames, this is entirely up to you. It can make some games feel better. It can also make some games feel worse. So I'd say leave it as off by default. And then when you get a bit more comfortable with emulation, you want to kind of tinker and get the best performance out of your games, then go back and enable these options. And the same applies to any of these settings. For graphics, we set those as part of our initial setup guide. There is a guy on YouTube called Warped Polygon who does some great videos about, he goes into real depth on what the different types of texture filtering and sprite filtering all means and dithering. I know stuff about it, but I'm not gonna, this video is gonna be long enough. We'll be here all day. It's Mother's Day. I should be elsewhere. So for the enhancements as well, I enable the Force 4.3 for FMVs, because FMVs, if you're not aware, are the pre-rendered videos that you usually get as cutscenes in a lot of classic games, and when they're stretched, they look terrible. So we want it to stretch the, or enable the widescreen on the gameplay, but for the FMVs, we want to leave them as is. Audio, we can just leave as is. Post-processing. If you are someone who is into shaders, then this is where you want to look at your shaders. So you can enable and then add a, so if you want a, let's try CRT New Pixie. This will give you a CRT shader. You can add multiple shaders as a chain and it will apply them in order. I don't tend to play with shaders. So what I'll do is I will disable the shader and then I'll show you what it's like with and without the shader. For achievements, I'm going to enable my hardcore mode, like I mentioned in the RetroArch guide. And then everything else, I should be, I'm already logged in. Yep, that's all good. Game list, if you want to have multiple directories, if, for example, if you've split your PlayStation 1 games between your SD card and your internal storage, you can have multiple directories. I don't tend to do that, but that's entirely up to you. Now, for memory cards, what we want to do is we want to create a new memory card. I'm going to call this one Alex, because that's my name. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it Alex if you want, even if it's not your name. I'm not going to stop you. And then in here, for our memory card type, you can set it to have a separate card per game or shared between all games. I prefer to do shared between all games, and then the shared card name, I tap that and I just set it to the one I just created. This gives you greater control and keeps things nice and tidy. So you have one folder with all your save data in it. Obviously, if you ever need to, if you import a BIOS and you find it's not working, then you can delete and import a new one in here. And then for our advanced, most of these don't really need to touch. And I advise that unless you're an absolute expert, don't touch them. So now we've done that. Now, the good thing about these, unlike RetroArch, is the settings will save as you apply them. So what I'll do is I'll boot up some Jackie Chan Stuntmaster. So you can see there, it's logged into my Retro achievements, and then it will boot the game. Now, what I can do, if I hold my hotkey and I fast forward, I can quickly skip through all this to get to the game quicker. So that's a little tip for you if you can't be bothered waiting for the game to load. So this is how the game looks. This is without a shader, so it's in 4.3. I don't believe there's a widescreen patch for this one. My controls work better. I've got X for jump. I've got square for me punches, triangles for kicks, circle is for grab. That doesn't work. And then what I can do, if I press my back button, which is the one underneath the right analog stick on the Odin, you'll get into the menu. From here, if I go to the settings, and then I go to post-processing, and I enable a shader, and I'm going to add that. Oh, I've added it twice, so I'll remove that second one. We'll leave the first one. Now, if I go back, you can see, don't know how well, yeah, it does seem to show, you've kind of got slightly bowed edges like you would do on a old CRT screen, like an old telly, and you've also got some scan lines visible as well. So some people really love this aesthetic for the nostalgia. I grew up in this era, so it's got a nice little bit of nostalgia, but I don't really care for it, if I'm honest, but that is entirely up to you. So you can have a play around with the shaders. I will be doing a video at some point to go through all the details of shaders and things like that. So that was Duckstation and our PS1 emulation. Okay, next up we have NetherSX2, which is going to be our PS2 emulator. Now, the steps for this will mostly be the same as it was for Duckstation. The interfaces are very similar, so you might be able to just, if you want to pause the video and go and have a crack yourself, by all means, see if you've learned anything from the early part of the video. But if not, stick around and we'll jump in. So let's dive in. NetherSX2. So again, we've got this onboarding wizard, which is excellent. As it is listed here, then these are free apps that are developed in developers' free time. Not every game will work. And I know, for example, the Getaway, I managed to get running. The opening cutscene ran at about 60 seconds per frame. It was awful. So even in spite of all the settings and all the tweakings, sometimes things just don't work, unfortunately. For the PS2 emulation, it's rare, but it does happen. For the most part, things have been fine. So I'm going to leave them on optimal and safe defaults. You can see here all the settings of that. I'm going to change my GPU renderer to Vulkan. Again, if you find some graphical glitches, change back to OpenGL. I don't recommend the software renderer. The software renderer is technically the most accurate. However, it is also the slowest, and you'll use the ability to upscale. So for our upscale multiplier, we're going to set this to our 2.5 native 1080p. So if you're watching this video and you're not on a Odin, if you're on a mobile phone, for example, just set it to the resolution of your device to take full advantage of it. Next, we have our BIOS. So I'm going to go back to my Odin and my BIOS folder. For the PS2, I am using SCPH-70012. So this is one of the more recent versions of the PS2 BIOS. You can just look for the file name. They're easy enough to find online. There we go. So it's a US-based BIOS. It should be compatible with Europe games or Japanese games. However, if not, then you can import additional BIOSes as well. So I'm just going to tap that to tick it. I'm going to hit next. So for game directories, as we did in our Duckstation setup, you can just go to your ROMs folder, scroll all the way down and find your PS2 folder. So I've only got a couple of games in here just as a demo. And again, like I mentioned in the Duckstation setup, if you want to add multiple directories, if you've got someone an SD card, or you have them organized in your own weird folders that appeal to you and you alone, then Godspeed. But you can do that within here. Okie dokie. So I have got I have also got Grand Theft Auto, which it doesn't seem to have found. So we'll investigate that shortly. So what we want to do first, like we did, and you'll notice that for a lot of these guides, the setup steps, for the most part, are very similar. So you want to map your controls, you want to set your graphics settings, and then you want to boot a game. So we'll start with controller settings. So as we did for Duckstation, we're going to disable the touchscreen because we don't need it. Controller port 1, DualShock 2. We'll do the automatic mapping, and then we'll change the face buttons. So that's our triangle, our circle, our X, and our square. As someone, like I said, who grew up with the PlayStation, I know those buttons like the back of my hand. And I'd always advise, for the controllers, don't go off what the buttons say, go off the directions, because it will help a lot if you're familiar with those systems with the muscle memory. So there we are. And for our hotkeys, I'm just going to set up my turbo fast forward as toggle, and then leave it at that. I don't really need to do any others. Now for our app settings, I'm going to enable the patch codes. We're going to enable save state on shutdown just in case. It's always good to have that backup. Don't need to show the FPS unless you really, really want to. That's all personal choice. System, we'll leave those as defaults. I haven't looked into networking too much. Like I mentioned earlier, that is something I'll be covering in a later video. And then for frame limits for NTSC and frame limits for PAL, if you're in the UK or Europe, the PAL region notoriously had a slightly lower refresh rate, which made the games feel a tad slower. So I bump this up to 60 Hz. However, most of the ROMs I have are the US versions anyway, so they'll run natively at 60 Hz. So we set our GPU renderer earlier. And then the only thing I change on here is for the anisotropic filtering, I use 16 times. So this is to do with distance and how wide it filters the distance. Again, check out Warped Polygon's videos. He's done some great stuff about the details of this, but that's just how I enable it. You don't have to do that. That's just a personal preference. For aspect ratio, I will leave it on auto standard. For the FMV, I'll leave it as normal. However, I will enable these options down here. So our widescreen patches and our no interlacing patches. So if there is a compatible patch that the emulator finds, a lot of them are already built in, it will automatically apply it. If there isn't, it will just do it as 4:3. It'll still apply the upscaling, but it won't have the kind of native... Basically, they're essentially cheats that run in the background to force it into widescreen and to disable interlacing. If you're not sure what interlacing is, it's the lines. So the image used to be rendered as loads of different lines, and you could kind of see the individual lines. Audio we can leave as is. Memory cards. Now, similar to Duckstation, we're going to create in this case, it's a folder rather than a memory card. So we'll create a new card. So we've got our 8 meg, our 16 meg, and then we want our folder. So what this will do is for each game, it'll create a subfolder with that game's ID, and then it's much easier, in my opinion, to manage. So we'll hit folder, and then I'm going to call this Alex. Again, you can call it whatever you like. You can even call it Alex, even if it's not your name. We'll hit create, and then we'll make sure it's enabled. And then for memory card 1, the card name, I'm going to tap that and then set it to that folder. For our games lists, we don't need to add another one. It's already there. We did that in the setup. Same for the BIOS. The achievements, I'm going to enable my hardcore mode. And then, as I did before, I'm going to log in. So look away now, peeps. So there we go. I've just logged in. It will generate the token that it needs. And then I can see that there's a link to my profile there as well. So I'm Alex1Cook on Retro Achievements, so feel free to follow me if you like. And then for the advanced stuff, I'm just going to leave all that as is. Like I said, the beauty of emulation is the tinkering and the tweaking. So most of these games, I think, run in a manner which I consider perfectly playable. However, if you really want to dive into the minutiae of making it run as close to it originally did, or to take full advantage of the device, you can do so. But I advise using this as a starting base and then building on it. So there we are. So I think what we can do is just boot a game. So let's boot God of War. So for my PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PSP games, I am using what's called CHD files, compressed hunks of data. What they are is compressed versions of the games that run really well with these emulators. I have got a guide, like I mentioned earlier, about shrinking those ROMs, so do be sure to check that out. The link will be in the description. But you can also use ISOs, and it will work fine. So here we are, God of War. So I don't know if you caught that little pop-up at the beginning. It had found a patch for the widescreen, so you can see it's rendered native widescreen. So I'm just going to skip through Kratos waffling on about some sad stuff that he does, as he's known to do.
Now there is no hope.
So I am fast forwarding this, but it doesn't quite move as quickly as the PS1 emulator, because it's a pre-rendered cutscene. So we'll just get into the gameplay.
Kratos had once been a champion of the gods.
I will send you back to the depths of Hades.
And my capture card's died. So I'm just gonna, before Kratos gets minced, I'm gonna very quickly reboot the capture software. Oh, so as you can see, I've upscaled it so it looks gorgeous. I don't know if my OBS will capture it running at the 60 FPS, but it does run absolutely beautifully using, for the most part, the default settings of the emulator. That goes to show that the power that's in these handhelds now is absolutely second to none. As always, if you press your back button, you can go to your settings straight from here, and then I don't believe this has shaders that I'm aware of. You can simulate a CRT, but like I said, for the most part, or you can override the geometry shaders and textures and things like that, but I just prefer to leave it as is to make it look as good as possible. So I'm also going to see why didn't... So I have Grand Theft Auto San Andreas installed or saved in my folder. Why didn't it find it? So I'm going to go to my ROMs. I'm going to go to the PS2 folder. So I can see it's there. Ah, I think I know what might be the issue. So Nether SX2, that's Duckstation. Nether SX2 is a older emulator compared to something like ARM SX2, which is newer. Because I'm using the CHD versions of this, and this is something that I cover in my ROM shrinking folder, some of them are compressed using a method called Create CD, which is compatible with Nether SX2. Recently, there was an update which now does Create DVD, which is not compatible with Nether SX2. So if you are converting your ROMs, do make sure that they're compatible with your emulator of choice. I cover this in that other video, but that's just something to be aware of, that a lot of these apps might require some updates in order for them to get the full features. So that was Nether SX2. And next up, we have PPSSPP for our PSP. I really wish it had a better name. It's a great emulator. Let's dive in. PPSSPP. So this works a little bit differently to those other two we've covered. So this is going to ask us to create or choose a PSP folder. So we're going to want to do that. So we're going to click OK. And what I tend to do for any of these apps or front ends where it says, please give us a folder that we can use, I create it on the root storage. So I'm going to make a new folder here, and I'm going to call this one PPSSPP. I'm going to use that folder. So what this will do is it will save all the relevant PSP data in there. Okay, there we go. So firstly, we'll go to settings. By default, the backend is Vulkan. Leave it as is. For rendering resolution, we'll do the 4 times for the 1080p. We don't want to use the software rendering. Like I said, it's technically the most accurate, but you do lose the ability to upscale. And then for our display resolution, we'll do 4 times as well. So you can set things like frame skipping, and it can make games feel smoother. However, I prefer to leave them off by default, because what you can do with these emulators is you can do per game settings. So if you find that one game works better with a certain configuration, you can save that as a unique configuration file for that game, which will load when you boot the game. So I prefer to set these as the base level and then go from there. So also for the texture upscaler, I use the 4x BRZ. This can help sometimes with the texturing. Anisotropic filtering I'll leave on 16, as I did on the Nether SX2. Don't have the Google Cardboard VR. Now for control mapping, these should be set okay, but what I'm going to do is for the keys, I'm just going to delete what's already in there by tapping the little trash can icon, and then I'll go through and do them myself. Unfortunately, there's no automatic mapping for this, so it can be good just to do it yourself to double check. So you just tap on each one, press the corresponding key, and go from there. Obviously for L and R, because the PSP only had an L and an R, and we've got L1, R1, L2, R2, you can map multiple, which I do tend to do. So I'll do L, and then I'll press the little plus button, and I'll add L2 as well. So now, if I press either of those buttons, it will register it as a L. And the same for the R. And then obviously we only have one analog, so I'm going to use the left analog. Don't need any control modifiers. So you can have the fast forward and things like that. For the Odin, what I tend to do is I remove these, and instead I do it as the back button that's on here. Specifically the Z button, it says there. So that's the button on the rear of the device. And then for the pause, I just use the back button that's on the front of the device, just because that's how a lot of the other emulators work by default. And then everything else, don't really need. What's in the extended controls? So you can do right analog stick up and down. However, I've not come across anything that uses that. There might be some mods and hacks out there that are more applicable to that. Audio, we don't need to touch anything. Networking, again, I'll cover networking separately in a future video once I've got my head around it. Retro achievements, as always, we're going to tap it, we're going to enable it, and I'm going to log in. There we go, I've successfully logged in. Achievements are enabled, I've got my hardcore mode and my sound effects. And I do believe on PPSSPP, you can customize the achievement unlocked sound effect. So by default, we have, which is nice. Doesn't come with any others built in, but if you want the proper trophy sound, or I think some people have like the Sonic ring or the Mario 1-up, then whatever you like. And as in RetroArch, you can customize where the notifications display. I just leave all that as the default. And then for the system, I don't know if there's anything we need to set in here. That should all be okay. So now, if I press Browse, and then go to our ROMs folder, and then go to PSP, I've got a few games in here. So once you set that Browse folder, you can just refresh it whenever you add new games. Obviously, I'm someone who uses a front end, so most of that will be handled by the front end. But I always advise setting it up this way, testing the games as they are, so that when we get to the front end stage later, you'll be confident knowing that the games do work and you have tested them. So we'll do some Peace Walker. So it's logged into my retro achievements. And there we are. So as you can see, like I said earlier, most of these setup guides follow a lot of the same principles. So hopefully the more you do it, the less overwhelming it gets. So I'm not going to get into this game too much because the start is very, very slow. But yeah, so that was PSP emulation on PPSSPP. I'll get that right one day. Okay, next up, I imagine the one that most of you might have skipped to first. Very disappointed in you. So, Azahar. This will be our 3DS emulator. So this does have its onboarding, so we're going to get started. It's going to ask you to enable some permissions. So we'll just tap into each of these, press allow. It asks for camera permissions, but good luck, unless you want to plug in a USB one, which bold. So for the user folder, if you watched the PSP one that I just did, if you didn't skip straight to the 3DS stuff, basically anytime an app asks you to create a folder for its data, I just create it in the root storage. So in the case of PPSSPP, my folder is there with all the app data in there. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this one Azahar. So this is where it will store the actual apps files, not the games. Our games, as it calls them here, applications, we're going to tap that and we're going to point it at our ROMs folder. So if you're using the SDE folder structure that we downloaded at the start of the video, then the way ESDE refers to the 3DS is as the N3DS. Don't know why, but that was their choice to make. Don't know why it's not just 3DS. So you can see I've got some games in there. I'm going to use that folder. Okie dokie. And that is done to start with. So it's pulled my games through already. So Azahar is compatible with CCI files and 3DS files. They have to be unzipped. It can't read them inside an archive file like a zip file or a 7-zip file or a RAR file. What I have done, and I do cover this in my Shrink Your ROMs folder, is if you press and hold on a game and press compress, it will convert it to a Z CCI or a Z CCI. This is just a compressed version, so you can save quite a few gigabytes doing it that way. So we're going to tap our three little dots at the top. Now, as this is a single screen device, obviously, unlike the AY in Thor, we have to kind of set our layout a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is click Settings, go to General. I don't think there's anything in there. No, System. So we want to leave New 3DS mode enabled because some later games do require it. There aren't many. You can set your birthday if you want. I don't tend to do a lot of this stuff. It's always good to have a look through the settings. Obviously, we don't have a camera. Gamepad. So we need to map our gamepad. So for this, I just map it as it is on the controller itself. So we'll do A, B, X, Y. Select, start, For our home button, I don't do the home button because it's not necessary. For our circle pad, it will tell you so you need to press up and then right, and it will automatically be able to map the opposing axis. And the same for the C stick. We'll do up and right. So for this can trip some people up. So for the D-pad, we're going to use the D-pad axis. I believe this is some devices, how they treat the buttons. So for our vertical axis, I'll press up. And then for our horizontal, I'll press right, just on the D-pad. If that doesn't work, come to clear it out from there, come to this D-pad button, and then just manually map up, down, left, right. Triggers. So we've got our L, our R, our ZL, and our ZR. Now, for our hotkeys, I use the back buttons on the Odin for this. So you can do swap screens and cycle layouts. They're the only two I tend to really use. For graphics, so I found with this that things do tend to work better on the OpenGLES. You can try Vulkan if you like. Again, it all depends on what games you play. Some of them work better than others. It's the nature of emulation. So I'm going to enable the asynchronous shader compilation. What this will do is it will preload some stuff. It can cause some minor glitching, but it should reduce the stuttering and make the games run a little bit smoother. For our internal resolution, I'm going to bump this up to, so we don't have a native 1080p, so I'm going to bump it up to the closest one, which is our 4 times our 1600 by 960. And then for everything else, I'm going to leave as is. Now for layout. So I'm not 100% off the top of my head what the default orientation is. We will find out shortly. So we might have to come back and fix these. This is all to do with how the game will display on a single screen device. So what I'm also going to do as well is, you might have heard the phrase turnip drivers. Now, what turnip drivers are custom graphical drivers for the CPUs that are in these devices. So in this case, it's the Snapdragon 8 Elite. So what we're going to have to do is download a turnip driver. So we're going to go to Google Chrome, and the one I recommend is the Mr. Purple. So there'll be a link to this in the description as well. So this one does seem to work the best. So we're going to install it from our downloads file. There it is. And now we will try and boot a game and we'll see how it goes. So let's look at Omega Ruby. So if we press back and then we press our overlay options, we can untick the controller overlay just to get rid of that. So as you can see, I've got one screen on this side, and then if I click the left stick, because I have the swap screen hotkey, I can do it this way. Just so you can use the screen that way. So I'll just skip through some of these initial cutscenes. So obviously at certain points our screen will be black. So I've also enabled the cycle layouts as well. So if you have a game that primarily uses the top screen, you can also just cycle through some of the predetermined layouts. That's probably the best way to handle a lot of these. So if you want to see both screens at once, you can use that one, or you can just go back and use that one. So what I'll do is I'll go back. If you want to customize these, you can go back to your settings, go to layout, and then if you tap into the landscape screen layout, you can do a custom layout. And then if you go down to the bottom, do the landscape custom, and then you can set the X and Y positions. Unfortunately, I think with MelonDS, you get a nice visual, so you don't with this, unfortunately. But for me, I think that most of those presets do the job. So there we are. That was Azahar on the 3DS. Okay, next up we have MelonDS. This will be for our normal DS and DSi games. So we'll open it up. This one doesn't have the onboarding wizard, unfortunately, but it's still relatively simple. So we'll set our ROM directory first for our games. So in our ROMs, we're looking, if you use the ESDE folder, we are looking for the NDS. So it's pulled through all my games there. So now if we go to our settings, by tapping the buttons in the top right, we're going to go through each one. So for our ROMs, that's all fine. You can set your save files and your save states. I'm just going to leave them by default. You can set the internal firmware settings if you like. I don't tend to bother with that kind of thing. Now for our video for the renderer, we want to change it to OpenGL. For some reason, Vulkan's not an option on this one, but it will be infinitely faster than the software renderer. For the internal resolution, we want to bump it up to, we'll go to 5x native, because it doesn't have the exact dimensions to take advantage of the 1080p, but it's close enough. You can add a filter on here if you want. This is the equivalent of a shader. So, for example, if you have the LCD shader, you kind of get almost like the little squares that you can see. I'm going to leave this off for now. Audio. So you can enable sound. For your microphone source, you can enable the device microphone, and that will, if you allow it while using the app. Just so if you've got any games that require that. Now for our key mapping. So, same as we've done a lot by now, we're just gonna go through and set our keys. So for these, I do advise for the back buttons, you can set them to swap screens. And you can also set it to fast forward as well if you like, or toggle lid. So now we're going to look at layouts. So by default, there'll be the default. So I can't remember off the top of my head how this looks. So what I'm going to do is we'll have a look at the default layout, and then I'll show you how to create a new one if the default layout doesn't work for you. You can also log in with your retro achievement, so I'll do that now again for the millionth time. So you can also enable cheats and import cheats from databases, although because I play Retro Achievements Hardcore, I don't tend to do that. But I will have a video coming out in the next few weeks about all things cheats for you non-elite gamers out there. So let's boot up Pokemon Black and we'll see what the initial screen looks like. So first thing I want to do, if I press the back button on the device and go to settings, I should be able to, oh, I might have to do it through the input actually. So we'll do that shortly. So you can see that by default, we have a similar layout to the default for Azahar. If I press my button, you can swap the screens. And we can do it that way. So for me, It's not ideal. I think it's fine. I tend to play a lot of my DS and 3DS games on the AOI and Thor. However, if you really want to play on the Odin, if you don't have a Thor, then this is okay. However, I am going to disable the touchscreen overlay. So to do that, we'll exit out. We'll go back to our settings. We'll go to our input, our layout, and then we'll add a new layout. So this is how we add our layout. It's a lot easier than it is in Azahar. So I'm going to tap on each of these on-screen buttons. And you see on the bottom left, I've got this delete key. So I'm just going to delete all of the on-screen. You can delete the ones at the top if you like, although they can be quite helpful. I'm going to delete them because I've already set up the necessary hotkeys. So now this is your primary screen, the big blue one, and our secondary screen, the red one. So you can adjust it, you can change the size, you can drag them about. However, you see fit. So I don't know, is there a way to get them kind of as close to equal as possible? I don't really know what the best layout for me. The default one is fine. Like I said, I don't tend to use the Odin 4DS emulation, but it is entirely possible. So once you're happy with that, all you do is you go to the menu and you save and exit, and it'll ask you for a name. I'm just going to call it My Layout, and then make sure that My Layout is enabled. So now if I go back to Pokemon Black, back in black, you'll see the overlay is now there. Oh, the overlay is no longer there, and the screens are now crushed into the top a little bit more. So I can still swap them using the hotkey I set up earlier. I can fast forward it. That hasn't changed. So that was the Nintendo DS setup for MelonDS. Okay, next up we have Dolphin. Now, Dolphin is our GameCube and Wii emulator. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'll only be focusing on the GameCube side because although the games run well enough on the Wii version, trying to set up the controllers is a nightmare. So I would not recommend playing the Wii games on this. For me, I have a Dolphin bar and an original Wiimote set up. So if I want to play my Wii games, that's how I do it, with an original Wiimote, because trying to do it without, oh, it's a nightmare. So I'll boot up Dolphin. So first thing we need to do is add our games. So we'll go to our ROMs folder. We'll find, so as I said previously, for the GameCube, it's referred to as GC if you're using the ESDE folder. Obviously, if you're not and you've called it GameCube, point it to that folder. As well, I am using the RVZ files for this. So these are compressed versions of the ISO. So if you want to save some space, I did cover this, as I've said a million times already in this video, in my Shrink Your ROMs video, which I'll leave linked below. It's dead easy. All you need to do is load up your games in Dolphin. Ooh, don't boot them. You press and hold, and then convert the file. And what it'll do is it will create a shrunken version of the same file. And the RVZ file is specific to Dolphin. So compatibility-wise, it's pretty flawless. So now we've added our GameCube games, we're going to go to our settings. First, we're going to do our config. This is our general kind of configuration. So we'll enable change disks automatically for those Twin Snakes players out there. And we'll enable save states just in case. So for interface, we'll make sure, yeah, we'll leave those on. Although I do like enabling the black backgrounds to take full advantage of that gorgeous OLED. So for audio we can just leave as is. Paths, so if you want to specify your specific paths, you can do so. I just leave them as the default. Now we're going to look at our specific GameCube settings. So for our GameCube slot device, this is our memory card. I leave it as the GCI folder. So if you watched the Duckstation and the Nether Essex 2 setup guides a moment ago, then this is the same principle. It keeps all the games in a folder, all the save data. And for Wii, you can enable the widescreen patches. And then you can sync it with the SD sync folder. But like I said, I won't be getting into the Wii setup because controller-wise, I have not been able to find a controller setup that feels good on the Wii. Like, I've tried a few times and then I thought, I'm just going to play on the PC because this is annoying. I'll probably do a proper Wii update once I've got my head around it. But for now, don't worry about it. As always, I'm going to log into our retro achievements. There we are. We're all logged in. I think most of I'll enable the progress notifications, and then everything else I'll just leave as defaults. And then for advanced, most of these we will just leave as is. Yep, all of them. We'll leave as default. Now for GameCube input. So you have all these different options. However, I'm going to stick just with the standard controller. Once you've done that, we're going to hit that little settings icon at the side, and then you can set your controller profile. So we're going to go through, and then what I do for this, like I said earlier, so for the GameCube, I don't map the buttons to match what I can see in front of me because the GameCube button layout is very different. So I go off the directions. So for my A button, I have the B button. For my B button, I have the Y button, because if you remember on the GameCube controller, the B button is on the left. For the X button, that's on the right, so I'm going to use the A button. For the Y, that is at the top, that's going to be the X. My frame of reference for this is the Tony Hawk's games. So I have my Ollie on B, on the Odin. I have my grabs on the right, my kickflips and stuff on the left, and my grinds on the top. That's my frame of reference. That's how it helps me. And then for our Z button, we're just going to use R1. And start is going to be start. Nice and easy. Control stick, we'll do our usual up, down, left, right. And for our C stick, we'll just use our right analog stick to do the exact same. Although I did mess that one up. So if you do mess one up, tap it again, press clear, and then just do it again. There we go. Triggers, L and R. And then for the left analog, right analog, just do the exact same, L and R. What this means is, so for the GameCube triggers, they have a digital and an analog. If you imagine you're driving a car, you press the pedal, you can control how far that pedal is pressed down. That's analog. However, if you want a classic L, R, on, off, the same as you would with any other button, that's what your standard ones are, the non-analog ones, the digital ones. So set them to the both buttons and it will register them the same. D-pad, up, down, left, right. I've not set up the Triforce. You can enable always connected if you want, but unless you're planning on taking this thing apart, and I wouldn't advise it because it's expensive, you can leave it as is. Like I said, I'll leave Wii input for now because I could not for the life of me find a good enough profile to base it off. So now we will boot up some Paper Mario. So once you boot the game, I'm going to press my back button and I'm going to go to my overlay controls and I'm going to edit the layout. Where's the removal? Whoop. So you can't just turn the opacity to 0 is how you do it. For some reason, I don't think there's just a way to... Oh, there's toggle. You can toggle them all off or on instead, which is probably the best way to do it so you don't hit them anyway. So you can see here that my load states are disabled. That's because I'm playing on hardcore mode on Retro Achievements. So we'll get into the game. Like I said, Dolphin is probably one of the longest running emulators and probably one of the best. Ooh. So I ignored that and it worked fine. So sometimes you might come across those little warning messages. Just ignore them, see how far you get. And if they don't work, that's what Google's for. Or my Discord, so feel free to join that as well. So here we go, Paper Mario. It's going to ask me to create a save file. I will do that now. And you'll get this little notification that it's written the contents to that GCI folder. So there we are. That is the GameCube portion of Dolphin for the Odin 3. Okay, we're nearly there, guys. Don't worry. So next up we have Cemu. This is going to be our Wii U emulator. So we'll open it up. We'll go to settings. So we'll work our way through. So for our general settings, we're going to add our game path, so which is our ROMs folder. So we'll add the folder, we'll go to ROMs, and we'll go to our Wii U folder. So I only have one game installed, and for Wii U, I am using WII files. These are the best files that you'll want. So if you have WUD or WX, I wouldn't use those. If you can find WII files, use those because they'll give you the least amount of hassle. So the gamepad position, it says it's on the right. So I just leave that as the default input settings. So we'll, the overlay is disabled by default. Why can't they all be like that? Controller 1 will enable. We're going to set it as the Wii U gamepad. And then you can just tap this button to do set up all inputs, and it will do it for you. So just double check. It should be perfectly correct because it's using the same layout as the Odin. But if you find that something's not quite right, then do double check. So I'm going to enable this toggle screen as well. So this will give us a button that allows us to flip between the TV screen and then the gamepad screen. So for graphic settings, custom drivers, we can add that same driver that we had. I think it was in my downloads folder, the Mr. Purple Turnip. And then enable that. And then I'm going to leave everything else as the default. Audio settings, you can leave as is. You can enable the audio output for the Wii U gamepad as well. However, you've already got the TV audio output, so you'd be getting 2 audio outputs, so it'd be a bit annoying. Overlay settings, they're disabled, that's fine. Account settings, again, this is the online play stuff that I'll be covering in the future once I've got my head around it. So let's try and boot up Super Mario 3D World. So you'll see there, it's compiling the shaders. I'll show you, compiling a lot of shaders. But the game runs a treat, so. One thing to notice as well is the fans have kicked up. So when you're emulating these higher systems, if you notice on the right-hand side, there is the little white bar. So firstly, I'll show you how to disable that. So if we swipe down from the top, and we are looking for, what's it called? The floating icon. We're not going to disable it because we do need it, and I'll explain why shortly. But we are going to hide it because it's a bit ugly. So we'll turn the transparency right down to 0. So you can see that bar no longer exists. If we swipe from the right, though, we get this menu. And this menu is extremely handy. So for our more intensive systems, we can set automations so that it will change the processor mode or the fan speed to a bespoke setting for that app. So if I tap, for example, the performance mode, I'm going to set this to high performance mode. And for the fan, I'm going to set this to smart or custom, should I say. And then you can change this as you like. Fans have kicked up considerably. And as you can see there, I'm currently running about 70 degrees, which isn't hugely hot. Like, if you start getting high 80s, 90s, that's when you should worry. But for 70, running at 120 FPS, it's not the worst. So if you notice now, if I go to my performance, that's grayed out, and the fan is as well. However, if I close Cemu, it should start to calm down. There we go. It kicked straight off and went back to the default mode. So what I'm going to do as well is in my fan mode for my smart, I'm going to set a smart curve because that went a little bit too insane, a little bit too quickly. So we want to use our GPU as the thermal reference. And at 65 degrees, we'll say we'll run about 30. And then at 85, that's when we'll start ramping up to about 50. Then anything above that, we'll ramp it right up because you want to make sure that you're not melting the processor. But these are built to last. So a lot of people have done thermal mods and things like that, and they have had some positive effect, but for me, it's not worth the risk of voiding the warranty, at least when you've just got the device, for the sake of saving a few degrees when these are built to handle it, at least at the levels we're getting. So what we'll do as well in settings, in overlay settings, I think it is we'll just untick that shader compiler. And we can untick the controller profile as well. It's not a huge thing. And we'll untick the friends list because I don't have any. And most of you probably don't either, which is why you're here with me. So now if we open it back up, we should see that we don't get all the shader compilation notifications up top. So it just makes it a little bit cleaner. So I can hear the fans have kicked up a little bit, but not as much as they did a moment ago. So it's still perfectly playable. Or you can put your headphones in and just ignore it. So that was Cemu for the Wii U. So now the big one, the secret one, the one I'm not going to name by name again. The one that you've definitely all just skipped to. How you disappoint me. So this is Eden. So there's a few things we need for Eden. We're going to need some product keys, a game firmware, and some games. I have these already. Like I said, they are copyrighted, so I can't tell you where to get them. The games, they're a little bit more difficult to find, but there are resources out there. So use the power of the internet. So for notifications, we're going to allow them. And then for keys, I have these saved in my BIOS folder just to keep everything nice and tidy. So I have my folder there. I nearly said it. I'm going to get my prod.keys. So normally this comes as a zip folder with prod.keys and title.keys. For Eden, we just need the prod.keys. You'll want to get the latest version that is available at the time you watch this. You don't need to keep it up to date. If a new version comes out, but yours works fine, just stick with what you've got. If you start running into issues and errors, then that's the point you should get the next version. Firmware, it's in the same. So for the firmware, I don't need to unzip it. It's just going to install it like that. And for games, just going to point it at my ROMs folder. Although, did I actually copy any games over? I did not. I'm a muppet. I'll be back shortly once I've copied some actual games over. Okay, let's try that again. So I've copied a game over. So I'm just going to hit next and then we are done. So I've got Pokemon Legends Arceus. So we're going to go to settings and we're going to go to advanced settings. So for this, I don't set it to the docked mode because it can increase the stress on the system. I know some people have said that they push the resolution to 1.25 and that seems to work okay. But again, try and get a game booting and then start tinkering is probably the easiest. So for graphics, I'm just going to leave it at 1 times. And then all of this, I think, should just be fine with the default, at least to start with. So performance overlay, I disable the performance overlays. And the same for the device overlay. And the input overlay. Audio, we don't need to touch. I don't think there's anything in the debug yet. So make sure the API set to Vulkan. Again, if you have issues with Vulkan, oh no, it's only Vulkan. So if you have issues with Vulkan, can't help you. One thing to note is, like I've said earlier, you can do everything correctly, and sometimes some games just will not work. That is the nature of emulation. Hopefully, with updates and patches, then that'll be something that is fixed. So you can set custom paths for your save directory. I'm just going to leave it as default for now. You can change the look of the app, the color of the app. I quite like the default, but I'm going to flip on that good old OLED background. Let's map the controls. So player 1, our Pro controller, and I'm going to auto map the controller. This should work perfectly as it is using the Switch layout. So just double check. Yep, they aren't changing, so we know that is all good. So now for GPU driver. The good thing about Eden is we have this fetch button on the bottom left. So we're going to press fetch, and it's going to tell us the recommended driver to get for our device. Now, I usually use the Mr. Purple turnips, as I find they work quite well. However, you might find, especially with Switch, that they don't do the job. So I'm going to do what it says, and we're going to get the Game Hub Adreno 8XX. So we're going to tap it there, we're going to download it, and then if we back out, so it's just going to tell you you've changed graphics driver, so we've cleared out all the old shaders. That's absolutely fine. Make sure it's selected, and we're going to back out. Now, even though these drivers are custom for the Adreno chips, sometimes the system driver works better. But I'd, by default, stick with these, see how it runs, and then go from there. Sometimes things just won't work. If you have DLC or updates, if you go to Manage Eden Data, you can install game content, and then you just need to point it to your files. I don't for this example, but usually a lot of the games you find online will come with the updates or the DLC involved. The same for the amiibo keys. You can install the amiibos, and then at certain points of the games, you can go into the options and select an amiibo, and it will apply it as though you did it on the Switch. So now that's all done, let's boot up Pokemon Legends. So one thing I want to do as well, as I did before for the Wii U one, is I'm going to set our performance mode to high performance and our fan to smart. Just so this will allow Eden as an emulator to take full advantage of the chipset. But it's good to do it that way rather than default into high performance mode, because then when you're running Game Boy Advance games or whatever it might be, that is pure overkill. So this runs great, it looks good. I have done more coverage of these types of games on my channel. So for example, with the Turnip drivers, for example, if you try and run Tears of the Kingdom, I think I tried it using the system driver and it crashed. I tried it with the Turnip driver and it worked brilliantly. So make sure you do get those Turnip drivers, because they can be the difference between something working and something not. Having said that, there are some games, I know Castle Crashers Remastered, the sound works, the game doesn't. There is another, nearly said it, there's another emulator called Kenji NX where Castle Crashers works absolutely fine. Why? Who knows? That is just, like I said, that's the nature of emulation. Sometimes stuff just works, sometimes stuff doesn't, with no rhyme or reason. So as you can see, this runs pretty well. We'll skip the movie. Can I get into the actual game? These first-party Nintendo games, they don't like getting to the point, do they? So I want to try and get into the game so I can just show you and demonstrate to you how this one runs. So you might notice, I can't really spot any on this, but I noticed for some games I've been playing, occasionally you might get the odd graphical glitch. Again, that's emulation for you. I haven't experienced any where the graphical glitches have made a game unplayable. Usually, if I can't even get a game to boot, then that's when I'll go back to the drawing board and kind of tinker. And these drivers, they are updated few times a year. So if you use Obtainium and add them to your kind of watcher, as it were, you'll get the notification when there are new versions available. So usually the newest version is the best. Not necessarily all the time, but in my experience, I've not really had any issues with using the later versions. So when Professor Laventon finally shuts up with his stupid hat, we can actually get into the game. So there we go. So now I'm in control and I can run. So I'm getting quite a stable frame rate, probably around 30 or so, which perfectly playable and probably as playable as it was on the Switch. Obviously, there are certain graphical mods, and I know there's 60 FPS patches for certain games. You can install those through the game content like you would a DLC or a update patch. So yeah, that was Eden, our emulator for that console that I know that most of you watching this will have definitely just skipped to this bit of the video. Shame on you. So that is basically it for our standard emulators. So next, let's look at getting PC games to run. And finally, but by no means least, we're going to look at GameNative for our Steam and our PC games. Let's open up GameNative. We're going to allow notifications. You can just sign in with your Steam username and password, or you can sign in with your Steam QR code through SteamGuard, or if you prefer to use Epic, GOG, or Amazon, you can use those as well. If you're not using any of those accounts, you can just skip the login. But I imagine most of you will be looking at Steam. So if I get my phone here, I'm just going to use my SteamGuard to log in. There we go. Oh, there's a new version, so I'm just going to update that. Okay, so that update's done. So this is GameNative. So you can see we've got my libraries at the top. Obviously, I'm currently only signed into Steam, so I'm going to select that one. You can also import custom games. I have covered these in other videos, which again will be on my channel, or I'll link them below if you need some more detail. But for a basic setup to get some Steam games working, let's have a look at what I've been playing recently. I've been playing a bit of Mugenics. Where's Mugenics? I could have just searched, but I thought I'd show off my ever-growing Steam library. So we're going to install that. We're going to allow it. So this shouldn't take too long. I do have quite good internet, luckily. So we'll come back once this has downloaded. So there we are. That's downloaded and installed. So we'll try and boot it. So the first time we boot a game, it will have to download some first-time setup files. Subsequent boots will be a lot faster, but we're just going to let it do its thing, and then hopefully the game will run. So there we go. It looks like it's booted into the game perfectly. I don't know if we have any sound at this point. Oh, there we go. So I'll just skip through this intro. And there we go. So I've got my cursor natively. I can also set my, I don't know if this has our controls there. You can also set it to gamepad mode. Oh, it was on gamepad mode, silly me. So if I select, so I'm not actually very far in this, but yeah, you can see it booted really well. I've not had to change any settings for this. However, for some games, you might have to. So if we press our back button, you can also allow an on-screen controller if yours is... Oh, I've enabled the performance HUD. If you need to, you can also edit a physical controller. So, for example, if you need to remap the buttons, then you can just do so in there. So I didn't mean to do that, so I'm going to set that back to what it was. There we go. Make sure we save that. If, however, you find that your games don't work, so I'll give that a 5. It seemed to run perfectly fine. If, however, you find issues with your game, So for example, if it didn't boot, for example, this is where something like EmuReady comes into play. So for example, if I were to quickly go over to EmuReady, so we'll skip the initial check. But what we can do is you can see here featured reports. Now, if you make an account with this, you can basically set your devices and make the filtering a lot easier. But if we search for, say, Eugenics, for example, we can see there someone's done it on the Thor. Odin 3 Ultra, so that's what I'm using. So it runs great. And then we can see what specific compatibility layers they used, what turnip drivers they used, any of the CPU translation, all that good stuff. So obviously that worked for me perfectly. But if you notice a game like, I think, what did I try and boot before that I couldn't get working? Oh, I can't remember. But you can see that not all these are perfect. So if we filter, so you can filter by perfect on Snapdragon. So this will give you a nice little quick reference point for everything that should work perfectly on your Odin or your Thor or anything with the Snapdragon chips in them. So if you are going to use something like GameHub or GameNative, then this is a must-have. So Product Devity, the developer, has done some great work with this, and obviously the bigger the community grows, the more reports can get submitted, and people should be able to get the games they want to run. So assuming you found some information on a game that you're not been able to get running, so we'll assume Eugenics, for example. If I wanted to edit my configuration, I could just go into the game, go over to these settings, and then we can edit our container. And then in here, we can see all the options. So for graphics, we can change the graphics drivers, we can change the wrappers, we can change the effects core for the emulation, you can change the controller on this side. You've got some wine configurations, some environment variables if you're more into tinkering, things like that. And then if you want processor affinity, so if you want to control the amount of cores that it uses, you can do so as well. So some games you might need to really dig deep in, especially when it comes to things like Proton, which has been absolutely wonderful, especially for the Steam Deck and to a lesser extent these, although it is early days and this app will continue to get better and better and better. So that is just a very brief look at some PC emulation on the Odin 3. If you want to know more, I do have other videos covering PC setup guides, and there will be more specific Odin 3 tutorials to come in the future. But for now, as a base setup, that was GameNative. Okay, so you'll be pleased to know that for the most part, we are done with our initial part of the setup. So if you're happy with using the system as is and going into those individual emulators and booting your games that way, by all means, you can stop watching now. However, if you want to start looking at some front ends, I'll quickly cover a few now that I recommend. So let's look at, firstly, at my personal favorite, that's ESDE. Okay, so first up, we're going to look at ESDE, which is, as I said, my personal favorite. So in order to get ESDE, like I mentioned earlier, you need to sign up to their Patreon. So it's about, I think, $4 or $5 a month, but you only need to pay once. Once you've paid for it, you can immediately cancel. In fact, they insist that you immediately cancel. And what's going to happen is they will add you to a mailing list and they will send you out a link so you can download the APK file. If you ever lose that email or you can't find the APK, what you can do is there's another website, which I'll also link below, where you can basically get them to resend the email automatically. If you just put in the email address that you signed up with, and it's instantaneous. So I've already downloaded it, so we're going to go to our downloads folder, and I'm going to install it. It's already installed, we're going to update it. So now I'm going to open it up, and then this has, as a lot of other good apps do, and a lot of these front ends do, it has an onboarding. So we're going to begin the setup. I've already allowed the permission. we're going to create a directory. It will create one for you, so you can just press use this folder. And the same for the ROMs. It'll automatically find my ROMs folder. As I explained when we set up these folders initially, this is the ESDE layout. So it has every system under the sun in ESDE, so it's a bit overkill. Don't rename any of these folders if you're using ESDE, because otherwise it will not find the games inside those folders. So we're going to allow that. You can skip creating the system directories if you've already done it, or if you haven't, you can just press create them. And then I understand. We'll give it a second. There we go. So depending on how many games you've got, it will obviously take a little bit longer to scan than that. So firstly, what I'm going to do is disable that touch overlay. So I'm going to press my start button to get to our menu. I'm going to come down and go to input device settings. And then on that, I'm going to disable this enable touch overlay toggle. You'll get this warning. Obviously, if you're on a device without a built-in controller, then you're probably going to want touchscreen unless you've got an external controller. So there we go. We'll go back. So this is the basic theme. I think it's called linear. It's quite straightforward. It looks okay. Quite plain at the moment, but you'll see we've got all this space. We've got no information, no artwork. It's a little bit bare. So this is where our scrapers come in. So if you set up a screen scraper account at the beginning, then this is where you're going to log into that. Or if you don't want to set up a screen scraper account, you can just use the GamesDB. The GamesDB is okay. However, the media available is nowhere near as extensive as Screen Scraper. Screen Scraper is the online Bible for classic game metadata. So I'm going to use Screen Scraper. So firstly, I want to scrape all the games because I know that currently none of them have metadata. When you add games, what you want to use, if you've scraped a ton of games already and then you add some more, you're going to want to use the no metadata filter, and this will only scrape your new games. But for now, I'll use all games. Scraping the systems, you can do these individually if you like. If you've got tons of games, I advise doing them one at a time because this can take a while. So this is something, if you've got thousands of games, I advise leaving it running overnight if you can. So we'll just select all. I don't have tons of games installed at the moment. And then I'll do the account settings in a minute because that's where I need to sign in. So for our content settings, I'm going to keep I won't use the game manuals. I won't use the back covers. And I think everything else. I'll keep everything else. And for mix image, so a mix image is it will take some of those artworks like your logo and your box art, your physical media, and it'll arrange them into a nice little kind of combined image or a mix image. So you can customize loads of the options in this. I'm not going to generate the mix images when scraping because for this particular theme that I'm going to demonstrate, I don't need the mix images. But you can if you want. You can also use the offline generator to generate them separately once you've already downloaded the artwork. But obviously I don't have any artwork yet, so we're not going to get very far. And then in our other settings, you can set your preferred region. So for example, if you wanted all the Japanese artworks for your Japanese games, you could do that if you prefer to have the USA or Australia, whatever it might be. I just like setting mine on world because some of my games are US based, some are UK, some are Europe, some are Japan. There's a bit of a mix in there. So I just set it on world and it'll find the most appropriate. So we're going to make sure for this first run, the interactive mode is disabled. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into my account and then we'll hit start and see what happens. Okay, so I've signed into my account. So now I'm going to hit start. So what it's going to do, it's going to loop through all these games and it will match them to the Screen Scraper database. And hopefully it will be able to pull all the necessary metadata. You can see on the bottom left, the API calls. So if you're on the free tier, I believe it's either 1,000 or 2,000. I can't remember off the top of my head. I have 100,000, which is ideal because I have a lot of games, which I'm going to have to scrape all over again. So, but if you only have a small library, you can just stick with the free version. So we're going to let this run through, and then what it'll do is once it's finished, it will tell us how many games it's managed to scrape successfully, and if there's any that it missed, it will also let us know. And then I'll do a quick demonstration of the interactive mode, we'll have a quick look at the themes, and then we'll go from there. So I'll be back shortly. So there we are. So all my games have successfully scraped. That has never happened in all my years of using ESDE. So I'll just quickly demonstrate the interactive mode, just in case some of your games don't scrape. So you go to interactive mode. You can also accept single game matches. So if it only finds one game, it will just pick that one. If it finds multiple, it will ask you. So if I pick a random game and I say Pokemon Sapphire, we'll edit the game's metadata. So you can individually scrape games this way. So it should. So it's only found the one game. So if we were doing this with that single match acceptance, it would just pick this one. However, if there was multiple or it couldn't find any, then we can refine the search. I have noticed that games that have a colon in the title, if they have like a subtitle or a dash, sometimes that can throw the search off. So you might have to be a little bit wary of them. But you can see just by doing that pass through how much better this looks. We have the lovely screenshots there, and it just makes everything look so much neater. However, this is only the basic theme. So I'll just quickly show you how to get themes. So if you go to our UI settings, currently we only have the linear theme installed. We also have a theme downloader. So what it's going to do is download a list of themes. That's a weird bug. I have seen how to fix this. Let me double check and I will have a look. Okay, so for some reason, there is a setting that we have to enable. So I'll quickly show you how to fix that. So if you go to your settings and then you scroll all the way down to Odin settings, and then in the advanced, we are looking for this Force SE Linux. So we'll enable that and then we'll try it again. And hopefully this time, I don't look like a muppet. There we go. So you have this massive library of themes. However, the one I want to demonstrate is first we have ESU Interpreted, which is based on ESU, which is a great front end, more tailored towards dual screens. However, there is a single screen mode. It's available in Obtainium and also from GitHub. However, my personal favorite to start with is Iconic. So I'll just show you Iconic. The thing I love about the ESDE themes, a lot of the other front ends, their themes are quite simplistic. So they're based around changing the icons or the colors. However, with the power of ESDE, it makes the whole thing feel totally different. So that's installed. So I'm going to go to my theme. I want to click Iconic. Also, as well, for the themes, we have tons of variants. So by default, we have the text list. So I'll show you that now. So this is Iconic. So it comes preloaded with all this gorgeous artwork. So if I go into a system, there we go. So we have this text list at the side. So we've just got the names of the games and then some box arts. However, if we go to our UI settings and change the theme variant to, say, carousel, we can see that we now have the logos that we can scroll through. Personally, I really like I think it's the box art grid. So this puts the box arts in a nice grid. So you can just, if you've got loads of games, you can just easily browse them. And it does give you the full box art, so it does change depending on if it's a longer box or like the PS1, it's got the square boxes. There's all sorts of stuff you can customize. And this is just one of the themes. I did a full theme guide on my channel, so do check that out. I'll link below. So that is ESDE. If you think ESDE looks a little bit too involved, a little bit too complicated, then next we're going to look at what I think is the underdog of front ends, RetroHrai. So currently RetroHrai is not available on Obtainium. It was available, however, there was an issue with the GitHub link. I think there was an issue with the developer's account or something. So whilst he's sorting those out, It has since been published on the Google Play Store. So we're going to go to the Google Play Store and we're going to search for RetroHrai. That's retro with, oh my God, I can't type today. RetroHrai, H-R-A-I. And there we go. It's that top one, the RetroHrai launcher. So we're going to install that. Shouldn't take too long. It's not a very big app. So RetroHrai has an incredibly simple onboarding. So already it's detected my ROMs folder. So we're just going to use that folder. And also if you have an SD card as well, and you have a ROM folder on that one, it will detect that one as well. It's brilliant. So we're going to need our assets folder. So just like we did with ESDE, I'll set up a folder called RetroHrai. It's going to detect the platforms. So obviously I've got folders for everything in there. I'm just going to tap this button on the top that says all with games. So it's going to automatically add everything where I've got the games. If you have ESDE and you've already scraped the media, you can set up the external folder. So you just click that, it will detect my ESDE folder like it already has done. If you've got it saved elsewhere, you can pick the folder manually, but I'm just going to import that media from there. So that should start to pull through. There we go. So that's pulled through all the box arts. So that is pretty much it. So you can press start. You can customize loads of stuff in here. It tells you what emulators you've got installed. You can back up your configurations if you want to. You can change the appearance. You can have a nice OLED. You can change the accent color. So I quite like that orange. That was quite nice. You can change the system fonts. There's all sorts of backgrounds. You can have symbols and there's platform backgrounds if you download them. A lot of these are available on the RetroHrai Discord. I know there's a lot of people creating asset packs and things like that. So do check out that Discord as well. I do cover, for a lot of these front ends, anytime there's a major update, I do cover it and go into a bit more detail. But just as a quick overview, we'll just touch upon the surface. So for our platforms, you can enable the platform browser if you want to back out and then pick the game. Obviously, this looks loads better when you have the platform images, which I don't yet. For our games view, you can change it to grid rather than carousel. You can set how many items per row. You really can customize it to your heart's content. So I like a grid. You can customize the distance between the games as well. You can create custom collections. So you can do auto and detect the platforms that way. You can add a platform. You can create a whole new custom collection. If you want all your Pokemon games together, you can just create a new collection and then you can just add the game. So if I search for Pokemon, I can just tick and add all the Pokemon games to a single collection, even if they're across consoles. So for scraping, if you didn't import the ESDE metadata, if this is your first front end, then by default, it will be signed into the GamesDB and IGDB. So you can set up providers here if you want to sign into Screen Scraper and Steam Grid DB, which is something else that we set up. For Screen Scraper, you just need to log in. For Steam Grid DB, you just need that API key that we covered at the beginning. But you can just use the built-in ones, and that's absolutely fine as well. So you just scrape all platforms, and it will go ahead and do its thing. You can have custom background music. There's the overlays for the game cover art. There's obviously a dual screen option, which isn't really applicable on a single screen device, but if you're on the Thor, it's brilliant. You can customize the controls, and then it will automatically update from inside as well. So a very, very basic look at RetroHrai. Now, the last one we're going to look at for today, there are plenty of front ends available, but I just thought I'd pick three in kind of different categories. In my opinion, probably three of the most popular ones. The next one we're going to look at, probably arguably the most popular one, and that is Cocoon. Let's look at Cocoon. So this is Cocoon. This is primarily a dual screen front end. However, there is a single screen mode on here and it looks fantastic. So Just a note as well, whilst this is available from Obtainium, you can also get access to the pre-releases. If you sign up to their Ko-Fi as a monthly supporter, you'll get access to their premium Discord, and you get early access to a lot of really cool features that are coming. But for now, let's just boot Cocoon. So you'll have our little guy Grub, and he is going to talk you through the setup. Very, very simple. It will just ask you for some permissions. So you can set your default home app. So we'll set it to Cocoon. Then we'll go back. There we go. It's going to ask you for some usage access, because one of the features it does have is playtime tracking. Although I don't know if that's in this live version yet, or it's something that's still coming soon. So for our directory, as always, we're going to make an own folder for Cocoon. Although do make sure you spell it correctly. Don't just mash buttons like I just did. So you can set your logins here. You get your SteamGrid API key, your Screen Scraper login, your Retro Achievements login. I won't do that now because I've already covered that in a lot of my Cocoon setup guides, which are available on my channel. So do subscribe if this is the sort of content that you enjoy, because I've got tons of videos out there. So I'll just skip that for now. So it needs to download a list of platforms and emulators. So we'll let it download that. Doesn't take too long, maybe 30 seconds or so. So we'll just let that do its thing. There we go, that's downloaded. So there are two modes that you can use Cocoon. You can have smart folders, which will scan your ROMs directory and automatically create the folders. Or you can have simple mode, where you create all the games you have installed will be there as single icons, and you can manually create folders yourself and organize them however you see fit. Personally, if you're new to this, I would go for smart folders. It's just the simpler way to manage things, at least until you get a bit more comfortable using these apps and tinkering in general. So I'll just select smart folders for that. And then it's just going to ask for some more permissions. So I'll give it the access. Then it's finally going to ask me where we keep our games. So this does use the ESDE naming conventions as well, which is why we use the folder framework at the bottom. So that's the wrong one. That's the actual ESDE folder. So in our ROMs folder, we'll select that. So this is going to quickly scan those games, and it's going to generate the hashes for retro achievements and things like that. Obviously, I've not signed into my retro achievements on this one yet. And now we can enter Cocoon. This capture software is going to be the death of me. So all I did was I gave it access to the ROMs folder, and then I enabled the file permissions. So then what we're going to do is, I've already done it because I didn't realize that my screen capture had died. But all I did was I went into settings and then library and data, and then I did this ESDE integration. So I set up my ESDE folder, and then I came down and pressed save and link. So now we have all our lovely little box arts, nice and easy. Also, if you go to your library and data folder, you can do your scraping if you prefer to do it manually. So if you've set up your SteamGrid DB and your screen scraper, you can do it that way and then start scraping. Also, you'll notice here, by default, it won't know what RetroArch cores you've got installed. So for example, for Game Boy Advance, when we covered RetroArch, we didn't have VBA Next, we picked MGBA. So you can just go into it and select the relevant core. And then if you press your Y button to save, it'll save those changes. So you can just nip through and make sure that you've got all the correct ones set up. You can also enable Discord Rich Presence, which if you're signed into Discord, it will let people know what game you're currently playing or what you're currently doing. So we are going to enable the single screen mode in here because this is technically just the top screen. But what this is going to do is change it slightly. So we get this lovely little preview at the top. And also, that's a big Pikachu, that. We can go through and then the images we've scraped will appear at the top. So like I said, this is primarily for a dual screen device, but the single screen version also looks pretty cool as well, in my opinion. Also to note, if you click the left analog stick, you can change how many folders are displayed at once. Nice and simple. You can also access all your apps using this little grid button on the bottom, and you can add your favorite apps to the bottom using that dock. So I've got Chrome, I tend to have a file browser, maybe YouTube, whatever you want. So that is an extremely brief look at Cocoon. So well done if you watched this whole thing. Well done if you did it in one sitting. Like, I'll be giving Scorsese a run for his money with how long this video has been. But hopefully you found this guide useful. Please, I'll leave the link below. Join the Discord if you have any questions. Either myself or one of the other people in there will be able to assist you. If you felt overwhelmed or stressed, or you had a little bit of buyer's remorse because, oh, you don't really know what to do, do not worry. Ask questions. That's what I'm here for. That's what the community is here for. Please don't ask me where to download the games from. I can't tell you that. Use the internet. But other than that, any questions, drop them in below. I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe, or your hype points. If you're on mobile, they're a new thing. I'm really enjoying them at the moment. So tell your friends, and I will see you next time.